So those are the species we're going to be covering in greater detail. Obviously, there's lots of other wildlife species. We can talk about skunks. We can talk more about rats and mice. And if somebody has questions about those kinds of issues later today, feel free to ask. But I had to cut the level off somewhere to fit everything in. So those are some of the ones that we're going to be focusing our talk on today, information on. So now that you're all experts at identifying pest species and damage caused by these species, we'll assume now that you'll be able to identify them when people call in, right? So we'll move on to the next step of an effective management program, and that's assessing options for managing these species. And there's lots of different things that you might ask yourself when trying to assess what options are going to be potentially plausible to use in a particular situation. But one of the first questions I always ask myself is, how bad is the infestation, and is it bad enough to warrant some level of control? Well, I think if we saw an area like this inundated with pocket gopher mounds, we think we'd all realize that some level of control is certainly going to be needed, or this area will always look like this and have all the problems associated with that. But let's assume for 1 second that these are the only 2 mounds that you had in an entire area. Does that warrant some level of control?
Some level. I say yes because they multiply, and then you're going to have more eventually. So, in a landscape, in a home situation, I say yes.
I say no. Gophers are a natural part of our environment. They help things percolate through the system. They're part of the wildlife. I use raised beds with ground, with hardware cloth, and I love having them.
Okay.
I'll send mine over.
That's an important thing to realize. I mean, there can be differing perspectives on this. If you're somebody who's fine with having them around, that's okay. But you also have to keep up good relations with your neighbors, and your neighbors may or may not like having them around too. And so that's a difficult thing that you have to manage from time to time. But if you're somebody who does not necessarily want gophers around, and you have just a couple of mounds out there, I would say the answer is yes. You do want to manage them if you don't want them around, because they do reproduce at a very high rate. And so this one individual out here, she finds somebody else out there, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of other individuals where after a year or two it looks like this, and then after 2 years it looks like this, and now you've really got problems. So if you really didn't want gophers out here to begin with, then you definitely do want to manage them when the populations are low. That's actually the ideal time to manage them. It keeps them from getting out of control. Otherwise, this becomes an extraordinarily difficult situation to manage. So yeah, rodent populations, if you don't want them around to begin with, then you want to keep them at very low levels because they do reproduce quite rapidly.
I think I may have mentioned something about this in the write-ups, but when in San Diego, we have a lot of canyons and there are a lot of open space preserves and things. So you have your landscape areas backing right up to those wildlife corridors, shall we say. And so you have a constant kind of interface going on.
Yes.
And that's where I anticipate that I'll be getting questions, especially with out country, on how to effectively handle this. Are you going to be touching on that a little bit?
We're going to be touching on a variety of different techniques that can be utilized in those situations. But you're absolutely correct. When your property is adjacent to a natural area where wildlife control is not practiced at all, quite frankly, probably in most cases, those are situations where the homeowner is going to have constant problems with those situations. There are a variety of things that you can do to help mitigate that, depending upon the species that it is. And sometimes it can be as simple as putting up some kind of exclusionary fencing to keep the wildlife from coming onto your property. And that can work for some species. It does not work so well for other species. Where practical, though, that can be a decent option. Sometimes it's just a matter of being extraordinarily diligent at removing individuals as soon as they move onto your property. And actually, there's research that was done with pocket gophers that showed if you're trapping on your property, even though the neighbors are controlling on their property, you start to get a lot of those neighboring gophers that move onto your property, you start removing them from the population as well. And if you're very diligent at it, after 6 or 9 months, you actually start to see a dramatically lower number of gophers moving in because you've started to remove some of those gophers in that area as well. So if you're extraordinarily diligent at it, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel to some extent, but you will constantly have at least some migration of animals back onto that property, unless you use something like fencing to keep them out. And that's not going to be practical in all situations. So it can be a difficult situation.
One quick question about the bird, like I live on a canyon in North Park, and I sink in the ground, and you break your ankles walking through, and it's a whole mess. But is there anything about like ruining their tunnels or anything that helps to just kind of slow them down or deter them?
Yeah, that's actually another great point of why you don't want an area to look like this, because now there are tunnel systems throughout that entire area. So even if you magically waved the wand and got rid of every gopher on that property, there's tunnel systems all the way throughout this field now. So that gophers over here can get right back into the middle of that field in 1 or 2 days by just traveling down those old tunnel systems. Whereas if those tunnel systems were not out there, it would take them much longer to work their way back through that entire piece of property. So if you're in production ag areas, you can take a disc or something like that through and disc deep or rip up some of those old burrow systems. And that can be a great way to slow down reinvasion of those properties. If you're on a backyard property, then you have limitations on what can be done in those kind of situations. So yes, if you can do it, it's a great way to slow down reinvasion. But there are definitely limitations to how you can do that too.
Does the road tiller go down deep enough?
Probably not, but I will say that gopher burrow systems, the depth of them vary tremendously from location to location. So in some areas they've been as shallow as maybe 4 to 5 inches deep. Those are pretty shallow. I don't know if a rototiller would quite go that deep, maybe. But in other cases they're 12 or 14 inches deep, in which case there's no chance that it's going down that deep. So just kind of depends on the depth of the burrow systems in that area. One other thing I wanted to point out. So with rodent species, typically managing them at very low levels is the most cost-effective way of dealing with the situation. But not for all species. Let's say, for example, you had deer that were coming into your yard and occasionally nibbling on some bushes. Well, Fish and Game is Fish and Wildlife is probably not going to issue you a depredation permit to remove a deer that just occasionally happens to come into your yard and nibble on some bushes. And putting up a deer-proof fence is very difficult and expensive. So probably in those situations, you just need to learn to live with a little bit of damage. Is probably the best option for you in that case. So it does vary depending upon the species that you're dealing with.
Pruning. You let them prune for you.
Okay, there you go. Let them prune.
You can't unselect it.
Other aspects to consider are timing, the time of year that you want to implement this management program. And we've already talked a little bit about the importance of this as far as the food sources that they're eating. But once again, we're back to ground squirrels here. We've talked about the importance of this for food sources for ground squirrels. But there's other things to keep in mind with some of these species as well. Once again, when dealing with ground squirrels, we have to consider other aspects like the major activity periods for the different age classes of ground squirrels. We see, for example, that in wintertime, most ground squirrels are not active. They're not active because they're hibernating. So when ground squirrels are hibernating, then no form of control is going to be effective. Now, this is a little less practical down here in San Diego County, as they don't, not all squirrels will hibernate as much down here, warmer climate and everything. But still, some squirrels do hibernate. Also, in the middle of the summer, we have another period of inactivity called estivation. This is a period of torpor. The animals, it gets really hot. It's basically more energetic for them to sleep away the hottest parts of the summer than to be out actively foraging. The juveniles will still be active because they don't have enough fat stores to be able to slumber away, but the adults can. So once again, if the population of squirrels, if the entire population of squirrels isn't active, then this probably is not a very effective time to manage. And we can see that manifested down here on the efficacy associated with some of these different techniques. So it is important to keep in mind the time of year.
Where do you get those? I mean, how do you, is there a
This particular chart.
different species?
Is this on the pest note?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, for
It's in
different,
the pest
for
note.
different, okay.
No, this has just been designed for ground squirrels. It's
Oh.
actually not available for most of the other species. In part because, like for example, if we're talking about voles and gophers, they don't hibernate. They're active year-round. Certainly the fumigation part still plays a role. You still need high soil moisture when using burrow fumigants. But you don't get that influence of food sources on their diet and some of those kinds of issues. It's also important to understand the different costs for potential treatments. If you have 1 or 2 ground squirrels in your backyard, using traps can be a cost-effective, practical way of dealing with that situation. If you have 200 or 300 ground squirrels on the 3 or 4 acre property, trapping becomes very labor-intensive. Now, all of a sudden, there are more costly, more effective ways of managing that situation. So cost does obviously come into play here as well. And we do have to consider whether or not there are endangered species present on the property. The map at the right gives you an idea of the distribution of some of the endangered species found here throughout the state. This map, though, is by no means all-inclusive. There certainly can be other endangered species present in an area. So if you ever have any concerns as to whether or not endangered species might be present in an area, you can always contact your county ag commissioner's office, and they can help you figure that out. But it is really important that you do know that, particularly if you're dealing with some more rural-type areas. Because if there are endangered species present in that area, then that can influence the control techniques that you can use. And so you need to know that ahead of time so that you're not using something where you're not supposed to be using it. So with that, let's get into some of the different control options that we do have available for managing these species. One of the things that you need to be able to do by the end of the day is have this chart memorized. Now, in reality, I just wanted to show you, give you an idea that there's a variety of different control techniques that are out there. And this, of course, this list isn't all-inclusive either. There's other options out there as well. But it does vary tremendously from species to species as far as what will work for one species but not for another. I think repellents are a really good example. You see, repellents work okay for hares and rabbits, deer, and in some cases birds, but not for most other species. Yet repellents are marketed for almost all species out there. So it's important to realize that they don't work for a lot of them. They do work for some, but they don't work for a lot of them. Some techniques work quite well for a lot of species. Habitat modification is an example of something that works quite well for most species. Not for deer. Deer are hanging around forests and riparian areas. And so unless somebody's willing to get rid of a forest or a riparian area, habitat modification is probably not going to work. But it does work for most species. Baiting works for a lot of the rodent-type species. Burrow fumigation obviously only going to work for those species that live in burrows.
Would it be the same bait for all 4?
No, we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
How come not rabbits
For what?
for burrow fumigation?
Rabbits don't really necessarily live in burrows. Now, cottontails will nest in a small, shallow burrow when they have their young. Jackrabbits actually don't use burrows at all. They have their young above ground. So if you're not living in a burrow, it's not going to work.
Do you guys have woodchucks or groundhogs out here?
Not out here. There are marmots when you get up into some of the mountain type areas, and they will occasionally use burrow fumigants in those kind of situations too. Yeah. Incidentally, voles, you can use burrow fumigants for voles, and there are a few situations where that is done. But vole burrow systems tend to be so shallow that the gases dissipate fairly rapidly through that burrow system, so it doesn't work quite as well. So I don't list it for voles. Certainly from a master gardener perspective, that's not something you're probably going to recommend anyways, but I just mentioned that it is there at least. Trapping is another one of these that works well for most species. We're not going to talk about bird trapping, but there are some situations where birds can be trapped. It's mostly ag situations, though, so we're not going to be focusing too much on that today. The only situation where you might use trapping for residential populations would be if you're going to remove pigeons. For that, you want to hire professionals to do. Some cases, people will trap woodpeckers. Usually it's just one woodpecker that's causing problems, and if you can't scare them away, then trapping can't take care of that problem for you. But you have to have a depredation permit to do that. So we're not going to cover those in any specific detail today. Exclusionary devices work for a lot of species, not for ground squirrels or tree squirrels, though. We'll talk about why. Frightening devices only used for bird species, not effective otherwise. And shooting can be an effective option for a lot of these species on here, but you're not shooting in town very often. So there are limitations for that, too.